Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to have you all here. My name is Dolf Telintro. I'm co-leading the Cities Cluster here. And this particular talk is going to talk about sort of a project that we recently completed early in the year, which is based on 9 months of research originally, got extended into 12 months. We couldn't quite cram it in. But nevertheless, we have some research products that I'm going to be talking about. But if you're interested, there are materials that you can pick up in the back of the room, both the research report and a couple of policy briefs. So feel free to bring them home. I would suggest doing it afterwards, rather than all getting up now. Although one of us, having one of you doing that, we can bear with, undoubtedly. Good. So we're going to be talking about the well-being and urban protracted displacement, particularly focusing on the case of Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Jordan. This is a topic of global relevance, in the sense that globally we're talking about 21 million refugees. These are the estimated sort of numbers. These numbers, of course, always estimates, fairly rough, but nevertheless it gives us a sense of the scale. And we also know that globally, out of these numbers, about 2/3 are ending up in urban areas. And this is a critical issue right now. What we see, there's an emergence of what some people call the urban humanitarian-development nexus, where humanitarians are starting to think urban, where development people start to realize that people who are protractedly displaced, which essentially means which means that people might be displaced over a generation long. I think the average figures that are bandied about currently are around 2 decades of being displaced from your home country. This means that we need to start thinking differently about these populations, often highly vulnerable, located in urban areas, at risk of urban destitution. And both humanitarians and development people need to start thinking about how can we understand their conditions in urban conditions, rather than against the rural templates and the camp templates, which are very much informed thinking by humanitarian agencies historically. I should say, of course, this is an effort by a team of people. It isn't just me. I'm glad to see some of you here in the room who've worked with me. Rajit sitting here, Rajit Laxman. And this is also a collaborative effort sort of by a group of humanitarian practitioners and researchers like ourselves. And those practitioners were based on the ground in both Lebanon and Jordan. A French INGO called Acted, and our other research partner was Impact Initiatives. So we also worked with a specialist from the Notre Dame University in Beirut. You're probably familiar with some of these figures here. Both Lebanon and Jordan have made sort of an incredible effort in hosting very, very large groups of Syrians. So we know that sort of around 5 million Syrians have left the country fleeing civil war. Another 6 million are internally displaced, still within Syria. And of course, the Syrian war has moved on and is slowly progressing towards an end stage, if you like. But we know that sort of a very disproportionate number of Syrians have fled to neighboring countries. And particularly Lebanon and Jordan have made an extraordinary effort. If you look at the numbers here, Lebanon has a domestic population, 9.5 million people, and sort of taking on 1.27 million additional Syrians. So representing 13% of the population on top of the existing population. And those existing population, of course, also harbor already a range of refugee groups. Historically, particularly Palestinians have ended up sort of in these countries, but also Iraqi refugees during the Iraq wars. In Lebanon, this number is even more sort of disproportionate. Nearly a quarter of the population added on top of the existing domestic population. Now, just as a sort of reference point, perhaps, the European Union we're talking about, anyone wants to make a guess? What sort of percentage of European sort of Union population has been?
Refugees?
Yes, from Syria in particular?
Quarter of 1%.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's a very accurate sort of, well, Richard, wow. Maybe we should...
Coming in late, I wasn't...
No, I mean, with intervention like this, I mean, perfect. Exactly. But this gives us a very strong sense of what is going on here.
What's the number again, sorry?
0.25%. So we have, in the total of the European Union, we have just as many Syrian refugees as in Lebanon, more or less. Okay?
In 2017.
Latest figures, 2017, but of course the numbers change a little bit over time. The UK has committed to 20,000 sort of Syrians over a 5-year period from 2015 onwards. Okay. And the figure on the right shows you how quickly the initial sort of population flow sort of emerged. Within a very short span of time, sort of a tremendously large number of Syrians that ended up in Lebanon. And you can imagine that it has caused tremendous strain on urban systems. We know that about 80 to 85% of the Syrians ended up in urban areas. And in Lebanon in particular, there was a no-camp policy. So Lebanon didn't want to have camps. And that has to do with this historic experience of hosting Palestinians in camp situations. And we can talk about that a little bit later. In Jordan, about 1 in 5 Syrians ended up in the large camps. And the large camps, Zatari, Azraq, Al-Mafraq, they've in a way hogged the limelight. Sort of much of the pictures, the visualization of the refugee crisis has honed in on these large camps. But of course, it's only sort of capturing 20% of the total number of Syrians. So what this all means that sort of in both countries, which are already highly urbanized, there's been a tremendous additional pressure on urban systems. Basic systems around sanitation, electricity, water supply, urban housing, already weakly organized, already inadequately serving existing populations, have suddenly witnessed this tremendous inflow of additional groups of people who also needed to be accommodated. And this has led to a tremendous amount of densification in urban neighborhoods, particularly in lower income neighborhoods. Urban informal settlements are now, we see a growing and growing race to the bottom where the worst urban conditions are sought out actively by refugee populations, because those are the only locations where they can afford to live. At the same time, we've seen a tremendous amount of rent increases. I've seen figures which suggest that rents from the beginning of the crisis till last year have inflated 3- or 4-fold in urban areas. So as an average. And that, of course, has affected both hosts, particularly the poorer communities in these cities, as well as the newcomers. So many of these strains are borne by both host communities as well as by refugee communities. And as a consequence, there's been a precarious balance, if you like, very highly strained social relations. And it is in many ways quite remarkable that given the pressures that are occurring within the system, by and large, relations are peaceful and have remained peaceful, but definitely at a large cost. So the question that this research informed was, what modalities of reception drive what kind of gendered well-being outcomes for refugees and host communities in urban Lebanon and Jordan, and what explains for these outcomes? And the way in which we conceptualized, I should say a bit roughly, modalities of reception was, we wanted to deliberately include, and this is based on our understanding of urban systems, the role of urban informality. We wanted to include in our analysis what's happening in terms of both the formal responses, but also the informal responses in these urban areas. So we conceptualized modalities of reception as comprising those formal and informal arrangements, policies, programs, and implementation practices that constitute more or less enabling environments for refugee and host communities to enjoy safe, dignified, and worthwhile lives and achieve well-being, as people themselves define this. So a very long definition, but we wanted to be fairly comprehensive. So what we see here in the diagram is the different modalities, forms of these modalities of reception that were at play. And in a joint decision-making process with our partners, we focused on 3 key areas. We looked at economic participation, we looked at housing, and we looked at issues around legal status and rights. Those were deemed to be key areas that sort of our partners in particular wanted sort of us to help them make sense of the existing data, because this was a project running for 9 months. We were very strongly instructed by the funders, which are the Dutch Social Science Research Council, NWO, to focus on existing data. Rather than collect new data, they gave us 9 months to look at the existing data and try to bring some synthesis, because recognizing there's a lot going on in that particular space. And we used the analytical framework around well-being, sort of, which the Bath group working on well-being and development sort of used, which is essentially looking at 3 ways, complementary ways in which we need to understand well-being, both in a material sense, what do people have or what do they not have in terms of income, in terms of access to key services, etc. Classic capabilities, skills, that kind of stuff, what you have, what you don't have. Secondly, relationally, how can we understand sort of how people live together rather than living on their own? How do people achieve well-being through social relations, but also through relations with actors who are powerful, the state, and other kinds of power holders, if you like. And the last point is around subjective well-being. How do people themselves assess where they are, given the material conditions in which they find themselves, given the achievements and deficits that they have on their own well-being priorities? How do they themselves subjectively assess where they are? So that was essentially the analytical framework that we used. And the pictures on the right sort of again represent sort of those 3 key areas: legal status, housing, and work or economic participation. Now, as I alluded, this was quite a quick exercise, focusing chiefly on secondary data, but we did manage to cram in a little bit of primary research because we wanted to. We didn't want to leave that opportunity unturned. But our sort of main effort was around a systematic review of the literature. And this entailed screening 3 databases on a set of keywords. And we found around sort of 400 sort of journal articles that we then screened for abstracts, initially for titles, then for abstracts. Then subsequently we sifted out sort of the ones that were particularly relevant, we felt, and we screened sort of around 171 articles. So it was a significant sort of effort. In addition, we recognized there were sort of research reports from INGOs, from various other sort of organizations that we also tried to sort of connect with, and we had a couple of sort of key informant interviews with people within the, for instance, the UN system or within the international sort of efforts trying to support sort of refugee populations. And last but not least, we worked together with a group of women within an urban informal area, sort of in Beirut, and this comprised both Syrian women as well as sort of Lebanese women, and they themselves, through participatory video exercise, explored some of the aspects of well-being. And you can see the video sort of online. It's up there. We should be able to provide you a link if you're keen, but just search the website of RDF, you'll find it, and it's called All Humans Under One Sky. So what did we find? So perhaps the first question that you could consider is, why do people want to be in cities? Now, classically, people want to be in cities for reasons of economic opportunities, for reasons of social opportunities, freedoms from certain social restrictions. Cities are good for allowing you sort of to do what you want, to be who you want to be. But we also know that, particularly in case of sort of the refugee population, cities also allow for anonymity. They allow you to stay under the radar, to be unnoticed from the authorities, who you may have various reasons to fear. So, having given this introduction, sort of what I want to do next, I want to sort of explore some of the findings from the literature. What do we know about sort of well-being outcomes using that framework that we applied? And then sort of the next step will be to look at sort of, so what is the relation that these well-being outcomes have to, first of all, sort of to public policy and law at the national level, and then at the end of the lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about what is the relation to local dynamics, local policy initiatives, and other local power holders. So one of the key reasons, if we think of urban housing and sort of well-being, successes and failures, and particularly failures, are around sort of this chronic shortage of affordable housing. There's different reasons in Jordan and in Lebanon. And in many ways, these two countries are very, very different. I should perhaps underline that for those of you who are not familiar with the countries. Jordan is relatively well governed, highly centrally governed, strong state. Ultimately, all authority resides with the king. Lebanon, of course, emerged from a civil war in 1992, which, I remember it well from my childhood watching the news. It was always on the news. Beirut in tatters. So the civil war lasted from 1975 to 1992 in Lebanon. Lebanon also has a very different sort of demographic profile. If you look at sort of the social composure of the population, much more diverse in terms of religious affiliations, large populations of Christians, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Palestinian refugees, and then sort of various other subgroups. But in contrast, Jordan is much more homogeneous, with a very strong and large Sunni majority. In addition, the Palestinian minority is also significant and important in terms of the politics of the country. So what we see here across both countries is they both suffer from this chronic shortage of housing. And in Lebanon, this is particularly an outcome of, if you like, a highly neoliberal state, which has heavily privatized sort of housing. It has sort of, in both countries, there's simply the state hasn't built enough, but in Lebanon, the state has also actively withdrawn from building houses. Weak urban planning systems are in place across both countries, but in Lebanon, there are also evidence that where the state wants to sort of actively plan, it can deliver actually a very good outcome. But it hasn't always been willing to apply that, and particularly in urban informal settlements, it has deliberately sort of withdrawn its hands from making any kinds of provision for the inhabitants. Now, as a consequence of this lack of affordable housing and this skyrocketing of rents, people have been frequently moving around, refugee populations in particular, moving around in order to find the cheapest place to live. That may, of course, negatively affect their ability to develop sort of enduring relations with neighbors, within the neighborhoods, with authorities locally. We also see there has been a very strong race to the bottom, if you like, towards conditions of living which are materially highly sort of detrimental in terms of highly densely populated sort of locations people end up living in. And these locations typically, in case of both, particularly in Lebanon, this is the case, slightly less so in Jordan, but sort of the government neglect of informal settlements of different sort of types, whether or not sort of they were started initially as official camps for Palestinian refugees, which have over time become urbanized and sort of attached to the cities and become integral parts of the cities, or whether those were unofficial camps, again for Palestinian groups, or another set of camps, or not camps, informal settlements you can think of sort of in the context of Lebanon, sort of concerns sort of large areas, particularly in southern Beirut, sort of where local Shia sort of populations, rural migrants have moved to and have started living, squatting on land, not being serviced. So there are different population groups living sort of in informal sort of settlement conditions, and also are governed sort of by quite different sets of actors. And this we'll come back to in a little while. Overcrowding was very much noticed in the literature as being a key source for well-being failures. And this is both happening within the level of the settlement, but also within the level of the household. So households get more and more people living within sort of smaller and smaller spaces. And this is associated in literature all kinds of conflicts. Conflict within families, it's associated with badly behaved children, it's associated with violence against women. Similarly, fear of not knowing neighborhoods and fear of safety have also had particularly detrimental effects on women who feel constrained to stay within the house. They do not, but I've seen figures which suggest that about 50% of surveyed groups of Syrian women were not leaving the house, therefore becoming socially heavily isolated. And particularly given the conditions of these houses where overcrowding is growing and growing, there were real concerns about depression, mental health challenges, simply not having privacy and lacking peace of mind. Finding a place where you can just, step away and have a little bit of peace and a little bit of quiet. Harder and harder to get. As there is such a big surplus demand for cheap housing, the role of landlords has become the power of landlords has become incredibly skewed. And there are all kinds of abuses taking place between landlords and tenants. This is a very important area that's causing that's an area of concern for tenants. And in addition, there is no way in which refugee groups can actually go and look for protection from the state for various reasons, but they're effectively inadequate discriminatory legal safeguards, policing and judicial systems in place for the refugee populations.
Can I just ask, how much of this housing is rent by the refugees themselves? How much is provided by international agencies?
It's chiefly privatized renting. International agencies support the camps, for instance, in Jordan, and they also have made efforts to try to support private landlords in terms of offering upgrading of the housing in exchange for lower rents, but they often don't have the resources to do that at scale. And we're talking about huge scale here.
Yeah.
So the main housing options that people have are squatting, finding yourself a place just to strike down, abandoned office spaces, etc. Small pop-up informal settlements. Only very small ones are allowed, so once they grow bigger than 20, so the local authorities swoop down and make sure they are demolished. Private rental housing, and then we're looking at camps, of course, in Jordan. Those are the main types of housing that people can find. But we also see that about 1 in 5 of the Lebanese households, so they have refugees staying within the family. And although 3/4 charge rent, so there's a quarter which doesn't. So there are also other forms of hospitality taking place that might be important areas where well-being is achieved for both. Now, more broadly, so there's a very strong culture of hospitality that supports these millions of people. And this is not something to be dismissed. It might well be an important part of the glue that has kept society together. And these forms of hospitality mean that you have to offer people temporary refuge, treat people as a guest. But of course, these forms of hospitality also don't mean that people have rights. It's always based on a giving, and there is some form of reciprocation needed. So if we look down at what we can find in the literature on economic participation and well-being, there's a couple of things that I think we should first of all look at. Importantly, the war in Syria has had all kinds of economic consequences for neighboring countries in terms of affecting trade, exports of important agricultural produce, and it has had real economic slowdown effects on both the Jordanian and the Lebanese economy. So this has nothing to do with the refugees. Just simply the war itself has affected, has had some serious economic impacts. Now, in addition to that, of course, we see that the inflow of refugees And the responses by the state have been costly. The state has, I've seen reports from the World Bank which were talking about the Jordanians that have governed both having less tax revenues, having significantly more spendings to make in order to support sort of the inflow of refugees. And at the same time, of course, you can imagine sort of the labor supply has tremendously grown in a very short period of time. So some of those assessments are about sort of 30 to 50% additional sort of labor coming into cities, sort of, and people so desperate and so badly in need of work to survive, also willing to undercut existing rates of labor. And there's strong evidence that statistically significant sort of collapses in wages have occurred within these economies, but they have occurred chiefly for the poorest paid professions. This is really important. So most of the brunt of the inflow of new labor has been borne by the poorest groups within the cities. We also see the very important sort of most of the work that sort of the refugees are engaging in or are allowed to engage in better are in the informal sector, where of course there are important sort of trade-offs to be seen between gaining an income on the one hand, but on the other hand, sort of perhaps working in conditions where you have no way of saying no to demands that your boss might make. Hazardous working conditions, very long sort of working hours, essentially highly unequal power relations between employers and workers. And this, of course, has effects in the sense that you might be willing to sort of to gain an income, but at the same time you'll have to carry the humiliation that sort of work might entail for you. So there are important sort of trade-offs that people have to face, or that people face. Similarly, we know that in Jordan, I've seen figures for 2015 where 32,000 children are involved in labor. Children have become an important sort of breadwinner in many of the Syrian sort of families, and often for reasons related to fathers not being able to work, and that's often related itself to legal status. So for children, of course, this entails sort of a trade-off between being in school versus working, discounting the future in a way. We also see that sort of shifting gender roles within sort of households have created a lot of tension, a lot of family conflict and violence within households of refugees, where the men are unable to provide sort of as the breadwinner, where they're unable to fulfill their traditional role within these families to be providing and sitting at home and fearing to go outside of the house for reasons of not having valid documentation, for instance, has driven all kinds of conflict within households, particularly where women and children have subsequently had to step up in order to bring in income. At the same time, for the women who did bring income, they were still also expected to continue caring for the family and performing the caring functions that were assigned to them. Okay, what about I've been alluding to this, the legal status. Now, in many ways, legal status is underpinning a tremendous amount of vulnerability for the refugee populations, and is a continuous and chronic source of stress, anxiety, and depression. This is very well documented. Now, the process basically is that if you come to a country, and I should say that neither Jordan nor Lebanon have signed the International Refugee Convention, and they do not have official policy to offer asylum or to offer a status of refugeeship, if you like. Okay, so people come, they are considered foreigners, or they're considered guests, or temporary displaced populations. They've been given various labels, but the key point is they're not having a right to demand support. When you enter the country, you do, however, have to make yourself known, you have to declare yourself, you have to gain legal status. You have to be registered with the UNHCR, and then you need to obtain legal residency permits or status from the government as well. And of course, the government is also will screen you for security reasons, because there have been incursions, for instance, of ISIS militants in both countries. So there are legitimate concerns around security that the state has to take care of. But we know that the difficulty for many people in the graph here is for Lebanon. It shows you how the households having all members successfully obtained legal residency. And this figure, as you see, the graph is plummeting quite sharply from 58% of households having all its members gaining this status in 2014 to only 19% in 2017. So that means that majorities of households are actually illegal in the country. And that has all kinds of knock-on effects in terms of gaining access to services. Critically, this is really important. If you do not have legal status, you will not have access to health, to education for your children, to marriage or birth certificates. And these populations are often very young, so this is highly relevant. More than half of them are below 24 years of age.
So is that metric then for both?
It's for Lebanon. The metric is for Lebanon. I think that's dropped off but yes, thank you for asking. It's barring you access to formal work. And of course, if you're deemed illegal, if you don't have valid legal status, you are at risk of detention, arrest, and potentially deportation at any point of time. And this is a really important factor that is in people's mind, particularly if you don't have legal status. The fear of arrest and detention is a very heavy burden to carry. So how can we explain for these kinds of well-being outcomes then? So let's first have a look at national level policy and law, which have a lot to account for. We observe three different key findings. What's policy and law got to do with it? The first one is around the frequency of policy change. We observe that both in the areas of housing, economic participation, and in terms of legal status, the states keep moving the goalposts. And that's a really important factor, because it's very difficult particularly for refugee populations, to understand what are their entitlements, their obligations, and possibly, if at all, any rights. So this is an example here, and we've set this out in our report in more detail across these different thematic areas. And it was pretty hard to get your head around, because things, even as a as an analyst, you see there's continuous movement in terms of public policy.
So the first one is 1973.
Correct.
And I assume that's for Palestinians, because they're
What we've done here, we wanted, and this is what we did across the study, we looked 20 years back, because we felt that maybe it's important to think about how previous groups of refugees have been treated. What does it tell us in terms of the institutionalization of responses? So 1973 is coming up here. In this case, in Jordan, set about a law that determines that the Ministry of Interior has the power to determine whether or not illegal entrants are deported, and also setting out essentially the status of newcomers as foreigners.
That reform happened when people from Gaza came as refugees to Jordan.
Potentially.
But the thing is, they still hit, because it's something that is saying don't treat refugees as a special group. Until this day, they are treated as refugees after more than 30 years.
Yes, the situation of the Palestinians, you're right, is particularly, particularly acute in Lebanon, more so than in Lebanon. Although, so what's happened in Jordan is that Jordan has assigned status, full citizenship status to Palestinian refugees, except for people coming from the Gaza Strip. And that's about, figures cited are around 100,000 people. So yes, they are still deemed foreigners, but all the other Palestinians coming from the West Bank, for instance, they are have gained full citizenship status. And that's an entirely different response than has happened in case of Lebanon, where the Palestinians even now do have very little rights. They have no rights to work. They have no rights to own land or property. They have no rights of residency. So they are really a third-class citizen, I would say, in Lebanon. Okay, but the point sort of around sort of the diagram here was, and we can have a follow-up chat about that, is that sort of policy changes over time. So 2011, the onset, sort of open borders, everybody's welcome. Very quickly, as sort of the numbers increased heavily, there was an inability to deal with these numbers, and sort of the Jordanian government decided to close many of the existing borders except for one. That has all kinds of consequences. For instance, that all refugees had to, some refugee groups had to actually actively cross battle lines. But there was still one point where you could cross. But then further as the influx continued, by 2013, the government started selecting who is going to be allowed to come in. And large groups were sort of disallowed. So Palestinian refugees from Syria, not allowed. Iraqi refugees from Syria, not allowed. A young, able-bodied man of military age, not allowed. So there was sort of growing sort of selection of people allowed to enter the country. And by 2016, the border was fully closed after a terrorist attack that have killed a number of soldiers within Jordan.
Now it's open again.
Now it's open again. Last week. Yes, that's right. That's right. But then I didn't have time to update these figures. All right, good. The second point that we noticed was so policy changes frequently. The second point was there's a very strong interlocking of policies going on. So if you fall foul of one policy, that has effect on how other policies treat you. This is a complex sort of diagram in a way, and probably not entirely correct because policies keep changing. But we try to make sense of this. So think about somebody who sort of crosses the border regularly. This is in Lebanon. You first have to go to get yourself registered at UNHCR, which does a screening, sees whether you might be determined to have official refugee status. That means UNHCR might assign you that status to make an application elsewhere. So you can seek asylum, but in a third country, not sort of in Lebanon or Jordan itself, because it doesn't have sort of policies that can actually sort of cater to that. So you have to do that at the same time, sort of if you cross the border, and so you need to sort of get UNHCR sort of registration in order to get a residency permit. The situation in Lebanon was that you get the first year free, you can stay for free for the first year. After the first year, you have to start paying $200 per adult or adolescent that older than 15 years of age.
How often?
Every year. So that's where this little loop comes in. And you can imagine as the crisis continues and as you remain displaced, this becomes a heavy burden, a very heavy financial burden. Another way of getting that residency permit was to get a Lebanese person to be your sponsor, your kafil. He would be your warrantor, making sure that if there are any sort of anything go wrong, if you do encounter the law, they would have to stand guarantor for your good behavior, and they would be responsible. That was another way. Again, by creating the sponsorship category, there was a whole black economy starts coming up where people could buy for $1,000 a sponsorship of somebody that they didn't know, but who was willing to provide that service, if you like. This is all fine as long as you keep your residency permits. The risk is only of impoverishment over time. But of course, at some point of time, we've seen that within many of these households, not all the members were retaining this legal status. Once you become illegal, it suddenly bars all kinds of access to other services, including birth and marriage registration. So as a consequence, this is for Lebanon, I think 1 in 3 children are not who are born in Lebanon are not registered. Not being registered means that you essentially are faceless, legally faceless. You have no legal status, both in the eyes of the Lebanese state, but also in the eyes of the Syrian state, if in future you want to return. You become stateless, essentially. Extremely vulnerable, therefore. It also bars your access to work. If you have that illegal status, the risk are that in the town where you live, you might be stopped at a checkpoint, and again, you might be ending up in detention, arrest, and potentially the risk of deportation is there too. So legal status is an absolutely critical factor in creating vulnerabilities through interlocking policies.
So you have to be registered as a UNHCR to be labeled as refugee, and you need a sponsorship of either this or this.
The sponsorship performs a similar function in terms of making sure that you are sort of recognized.
Yeah, because in Jordan, if you're going to a refugee camp, you don't need sponsorship. You're just like...
Okay, situation in Jordan is slightly different. In Jordan, if you go to a refugee camp, you still have to be screened by the security forces, you still get UNHCR registration, then everything will be provided for in the camp. However, if you want to work outside the camp, you're not allowed, and if you want to get out, you need a sponsor. There it comes in. You need to be bailed out, as they call it. And again, the bailing out has generated a black market economy around these services being provided.
But in Lebanon is different.
Yes, it is different. Yes, definitely. But a key point is that, and this also applies in Jordan, the interlocking of policies is creating sort of vulnerabilities, and legal status is right at the heart of it. The third point that we highlighted sort of in our analysis is that the complexity of navigating bureaucracies is one of the key reasons why well-being failures are generated. So this is the example, I think, very clear for birth registration in Lebanon. If you want to get sort of it takes 7 steps at the bottom. If you want to get all the way to the end, you get a family booklet, an individual family civil extract. That might not be needed. You might need to get to step 4 if you want your child to be deemed having a legal identity. If you want to get your child a birth certificate, you need to get to step 4. Now, step 1 is, the child is born, you need to get a notification issued by the doctor or the midwife. 95% of the Syrian refugees succeed in that. Step 2, you have to go to your local authority, Muqtar, just at the neighborhood level. 78% sort of are left. Next step, you have to move one level up in the administration to the district level. 36% are left. And finally, if you want to register with the Foreigners Registry, this is where only 17% of the children are left and successfully register. Okay? So bureaucracy is intimately involved in creating barriers, in this case for civil registration for the children. But also at every point of time, it incurs costs for people to go, spend time, travel to offices, etc. And not to say that the chances of being kept on hold, being kept waiting for a long time, dealing with bureaucrats who may not feel like they have to sort of give you any kind of service whatsoever. So refugees often report this as to be extremely humiliating, having to go through the rigmarole of doing this. And that's another reason why these figures drop so heavily. So that's at the national level, if you like. What then about sort of urban authorities? What's going on in the cities itself? Is there something distinct that we should pay attention to? So we see that municipalities have been largely at the forefront of the response to the crisis. But nevertheless, the humanitarian response initially has sidestepped. This deliberately decided not to engage municipalities. That's now different, particularly on the back of the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, which identified a localization agenda. There's much more engagement with municipalities. And municipalities have been really important also in terms of initiatives by mayors. Some mayors have been very generous, others have been much more constraining and restrictive on refugees. So let me give an example. The picture on the right is showing you a banner declaring that Syrian refugees in the area of the municipality of Burj Hamud, in Beirut, are not allowed to go out after 8 p.m. at night till 6 a.m. in the morning. So municipalities, and this has happened in over 40 municipalities in Lebanon itself, where local authorities decided that people's mobility is going to be essentially constrained, regardless of reason. So you imagine the kind of consequence that may have in terms of if you have to go to the hospital at night, if you want to socialize, see your friends, etc., etc. Highly constraining and a big role for the municipalities. On the other hand, we also see that some mayors have been organizing events, sports events, bringing together different refugee and local communities, trying to balance and foster positive social relations. But essentially, we don't really know what's going on here. This is very poorly reported on, and an important research agenda to my mind. We should also note sort of that municipalities in Lebanon have a very odd relation to the people living there. The people actually not voting in the local municipalities in many instances. People are registered where they have grown up. So particularly in case of migration, people coming from rural areas to the city, sort of the chances are that they are actually voting in the village, but they're not sort of voting locally. So there's no political accountability or limited political accountability within sort of a democratic system. And the last point sort of at the local level, which is, to my mind, is really important and completely underexplored, or rather underexplored, I should perhaps say, is the role of sort of urban non-state actors that exercise public authority. So let's go back to these informal settlements, say in Beirut, where we can think of, the southern parts of Beirut sort of are essentially large informal settlements where Hezbollah and the Shia Amal movement govern. They have built up these informal settlements on sort of public land or privately owned land, sort of not being given any kind of services by the state because they were informal for long periods of time, but they self-organized and they built their own stuff and they ultimately organized politically too and sort of become part of the state. So that's one area sort of in Beirut. Then we look at another area in Beirut, the Palestinian sort of camps, where the state has completely withdrawn from any kind of governance. It effectively had an agreement in place with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, agreeing that PLO itself would govern and would provide security in these settlements for a period of time. It was later abrogated. But these areas are completely neglected, and there are, of course, popular committees, Palestinian popular committees, who are organizing people and who are wangling and mediating with the state sort of for various kinds of services, but governed in an entirely different manner. So those two examples of how within the same city you might be having very different modes of planning, of service provision in place. And we have, in a way, quite limited understanding of how these kind of organizations actually mediate those relations between poor local communities and impoverishing refugee groups. And these informal settlements are becoming increasingly important. They become, if you like, and this is sinks for the poorest. There's a concentration of the poorest ending up in these settlements, and these settlements are sort of governed at a distance by the state. And there are other actors in place who govern, and we have no idea how their way of governance, their rules, their permissions, the ways in which they provide access to jobs, perhaps to services, how they sort of play out sort of differently for those different populations living there. So whereas Palestinian sort of camps were originally sort of populated chiefly by Palestinians, now I've seen some assessments which say that 30% of the population are non-Palestinians. Okay. Now the humanitarian development nexus sort of doesn't engage at all with these actors for various reasons. One of them is that some of these organizations are deemed beyond the pale. I'm thinking of the declared sort of officially terrorist organizations, for instance, by the US government, Hezbollah, for instance, or thinking in Jordan, sort of Hamas has an important sort of role also for its constituencies in providing services, providing welfare, providing social protection. But the international humanitarian sort of agencies don't really sort of connect. But of course, there are sort of Gulf donors who do. And those relationships are rather sort of unclear, but it seems to be particularly of growing import. So to conclude, we see that sort of modalities of reception in urban areas are driving important and heavily sort of gendered well-being outcomes, both in areas of housing, economic participation, and in terms of legal status. And these are shaped sort of by national policies, but they are also mediated by local urban public authorities. That means that in terms of outcomes, we see highly geographically and spatially distinct sort of outcomes within cities and across cities in these countries. So we should not assume that conditions of urban refugees are all the same, they're governed in a similar manner, that they have similar systems in which they operate and try to achieve well-being. To the contrary, the situation is a lot more complicated. So to conclude then, sort of what we see is that opportunities to achieve well-being are based not just on who you are, whether you're a Palestinian refugee from Syria, whether you are a Syrian, whether you are an Iraqi, perhaps whether you're a Somali refugee, but whether you're rich, whether you're poor. I haven't really discussed that sort of today, but there's also evidence that sort of wealth determines access to citizenship status, as does religious affiliation. And therefore, it doesn't matter so much not just who you are, but also where you are, what kinds of well-being opportunities might be open to you. Thank you. There we go. Nice. Questions? Richard?
I wondered how Dutch Aid and is DFID also a supporter, how they reacted to your conclusions?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that Dutch Aid is paying more attention to the role of non-state actors in, particularly in conflict settings, trying to understand their role in governance, in providing various kinds of services, security, etc. DFID, I do not know where they're located in that respect, although I do know they are, I think, supporting the Center for Public Authority and Development at LSE. Although possibly through ESRC, I'm not quite sure how the funding is located there. In many ways, what we have done, of course, is some of these findings are well known. I mean, we found a tremendous amount of literature available, and it was a synthesis effort. But then again, we had participation of DFID and in end of project workshops and other donors and other agencies in that sense. So to that extent, they're aware. But otherwise, I don't know how well they read the IDEA's website.
I have two questions. While you were doing the research, did you notice, or I mean, what's the changes that you could see between Palestinian refugees and other refugees and Syrian refugees circumstances in the meantime? And the other question is why you think Syrian refugees didn't move to Europe, although they had the chance, and what are the reasons, what happened to let them stay in Jordan and Lebanon? I mean, what are they?
Well, I suppose at the beginning of a crisis, you do not foresee how long it might take. We should also know that, of course, there are important social relations across borders. Tribal relations, family relations, for instance, between Lebanon and Syria. So that there had been, already before the war started, there were an estimated 500,000 Syrian workers in the country, because there were bilateral agreements allowing free travel and free movement of labor between the countries. So there are important relations in terms of the families. People are intermarried, so there are very strong social relations. It makes a lot of sense to stay nearby. In many ways, you find a hospitable place with a culture that you're familiar with, people that you're familiar with. So in many ways, it makes sense to go for those nearby options rather than think of going to Europe. I would say. And your other question was about what difference do you see? Well, I mean, perhaps so personally, I hadn't worked in the region for a long time. Okay, so I have a relatively limited background, but I was absolutely shocked by the way in which Palestinians, particularly in Lebanon, are treated. They are, and that's an historical situation. That's the fact that you're not having a right to work, that you're not allowed to own property, that you're not even allowed to because of those reasons, to get. You're not allowed to have residency. That you're not allowed to even get a permission to maintain your house if you wanted to, whereas you have to from a municipality Those kind of things I find shocking, given that people have been there, from the first wave, from 1948 to the second wave, 1967. This is multiple generations, and it is heart-rending, sort of how marginalized the Palestinian sort of community is, particularly in Lebanon. In Jordan, of course, as I explained earlier, the situation is quite different. And I should add, before I go to you, Songchi, another very vulnerable group, sort of those Palestinians who were living in Syria, doubly displaced, and treated sort of doubly poorly. So the first ones who were not allowed to cross the borders were the Palestinian refugees from Syria. Makes you think. Sorry, Songchi.
Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. A couple of ideas I want to maybe ask you further clarification. One is the graph showing the amount of proportion of refugees living in Lebanon and Jordan was really shocking to see. 17 to 20%. It would be also interesting to know the amount of flow of aid they receive from the EU or other international, given that the proportion of people are very different. I think Turkey, in comparison, have received so much more in terms of the Western intervention, and they have kind of promoted themselves as a receiver, so they can have a more international mandate. I don't know about Lebanon because they have different relationships. And second one is about, you mentioned about the differences in rich and poor, status of the refugees. What about their alliance with the Assad regime? Would that have an effect in the local areas where the communities themselves, the host communities, they have a different attitude towards that regime?
Good point. Yes, very good questions. Thank you. The first point on aid, sort of the different countries have played it out very differently, and perhaps the Turks have done so most successfully. The Turks have about 2.5 million Syrians, but against a backdrop of a population of around 80 million people. Okay, so very different sort of in terms of the percentages, but the absolute numbers are absolutely massive, combining both countries, if you like. So the Turks have used that to wangle a relatively good deal with Europe, where Europe is compensating them essentially to warehouse the refugees. The Lebanese have been reflecting their general disorder in terms of governance. Perhaps they have been much less able to negotiate collective aid flows. The Jordanians have been better organized. They came to the Jordan Compact is perhaps the best example, where, and I don't have the figures in terms of the aid flows, so you'll have to look that up. But so the Jordanians negotiated in 2016 at the London Donor Conference a big package of aid, and they also negotiated preferential access of Jordanian-produced goods to European markets, coming from special economic zones, where the Jordanians promised they would have 15% of labor coming from the Syrian refugee population. So they were looking at to find both employment for local populations and for the Syrians, and force the EU to cut them a deal and get manufacturing sources, and also towards the future to keep developing the country.
Yeah, I want to add something here, because I was involved in this agreement, where in Jordan, the private sector had incentives to have more Syrian employees, and in this situation, they lose the identity of the refugee, so they can't go to the EU anymore because they're workers, they're working permanently in Jordan. And one of the incentives that the private sector had, the taxes would be reduced if they have 10% of the employees Syrian. Right. And that pressured the Egyptian workers, because the workers in Jordan used to be more like Egyptians, and that pressured the whole base of the employment in Jordan.
Yes, I think this is a very important point. In many ways, the competition right at the bottom is not so much between Jordanian hosts and the refugee groups coming in. It's actually the refugee groups starting to compete with other migrant groups. So in the factories, I mean, also in agriculture, the Egyptians have a big role, and sort of with Egyptian middlemen arranging for labor come and sort of do sort of the hard work. In the factories, there's large sort of South Asian or Southeast Asian sort of groups of women sort of working, sort of doing sort of factory labor. So there's the pushing out sort of, and the competition is actually sort of not so much with the host groups.
Fund and USAID fund.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Any comments, questions? Tina?
Can you speak a little bit about the relationship with UNHCR and governments of Jordan and Lebanon? Do they have good relationships, or are they quite tense?
The current one? The current ones are incredibly tense, as I understand it, because both the governments of Jordan and of Lebanon want sort of the Syrians to be going back. They want them to the war is nearly over. 3/4 of the country has been pacified by Assad and his forces. There's only Idlib sort of area, which still harbors 3 million people. But of course, the UN agencies, UNHCR in particular, of course, they argue it's not safe to return. So there's a fundamental tension. It's not sort of safe to go back. People will be at risk. And that also relates to your question, about sort of the connection between Assad regimes and whether there are some areas in the country which are better sort of in terms of hosting. And there is some evidence around that, that's right. I've seen some anecdotal evidence where Sunni Syrian sort of populations fleeing to Jordan to Lebanon in this case, have been better hosted in areas which were governed, where sort of Sunni majorities were located, rather than areas where Hezbollah was sort of in charge. So yes, it matters where you're going in that sense, and the religious affiliation sort of are factors of, can be factors of both support as well as vulnerability. Sorry, Tina, that was the one, right? Any other questions?
Well, if no one else has, I haven't. Sorry, was it something?
No, that's fine. No, I was just wondering. I saw a hand raising as well. I just wanted to make sure I picked up.
I haven't fully understood how much EU policy has been providing pressures and ideas on keeping Syrian refugees there, apart from aid. I mean, your point that there was a 10% reduction in tax or something, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
Is there a coherent EU policy towards keeping the refugees there as opposed to Turkey or whatever? And is it more than just providing aid?
Well, if you look, I don't have the full answer to that question, but if you look at the current budget that the EU Parliament has passed, there's a very strong rise in in border monitoring funds. So keeping people out, having more ships in the Mediterranean, keeping people out. So that's the story of Fortress Europe is still unfolding. The extent to which the EU is coordinating aid and aid regimes, of course, is slightly different because they have a coordinated aid package, but of course, in addition, and there will be some coordination with the big bilateral donors, but I don't think there's a common position on that. In many ways, of course, whether or not a refuge is offered is still open. It depends on countries' immigration policies.
Yeah.
So. Was there another question there? Or no? Okay. Go for it. 1, 2. We don't have to stay, but if you're keen, I'm happy to answer. Tina and then Sunchi.
Can children access education then in both Jordan and Lebanon? Obviously there's education in camps, but...
Yes, they can. Yes, they can, but do they? Much more difficult picture. So they have access to education, but particularly also given that children are incorporated into the labor force, there's only 50% of children end up enjoying education, I think in Jordan, for instance. So yes, they have access to education and of course to education offered by the state. In Lebanon, quality education is not offered by the state, it's offered by the private sector. And actually I have seen instances where private schools have made efforts to incorporate local refugee children to be part. So it's not that black and white. There's definitely also efforts by well-willing sort of schools to incorporate.
And since we had no budget in Jordan to establish new schools, all the schools did the double shift where the areas there's refugees. So there's like shift A, B, and sometimes C to be able to offer teaching for all the refugees. But the thing is, as you mentioned, the manpower there, because same teachers are giving 3 shifts, so by the 3rd shift, they don't have the effort, they don't have the power to give. So it's variated like a little bit, so it's not the same quality of education, but still they do have.
Well, there's a separation also of sort of children within the system. That's another important sort of.
Prior to the crisis itself, it was severely underfunded.
Right.
They didn't
Yes.
really have the facilities to already do it as it was. I mean, even you have 2 heaters per school of 600 girls. I mean, it's so the conditions themselves are not conducive to anything.
So prior conditions weren't good. Sort of the capacity was limited to sort of absorb sort of all the additional children. So one of the sort of solutions in both countries have emerged, or solutions, if you like, sort of responses has been to separate out sort of the local kids from the Syrian kids, have double shifts or triple shifts in education. And they've also limited, sort of, as far as I understand, the ability of Syrian sort of teachers to actually sort of to allow them to teach the children. At the same time, they've also sort of enforced sort of a different sort of curriculum on children, where sort of refugee children would be getting a Syrian curriculum and sort of local children a local curriculum. So in a way, also limiting the opportunities of building sort of social relations at that level. Don't you?
Related to the same question, the education and the immunization, do they have access to the children who are not registered by birth certificate anymore? Can they access
No.
now?
No. If you don't have sort of a birth registration, you will not access you can't even sort of go to UNHCR sort of to get your status sort of registered. So you will have no access to education, to health. So it is a dreadful situation. Yes. Right. Thank you very much. Mm.